The Strait of Gibraltar, September 1941, 2:00 hours. The water is black. Not dark, black, a blackness so complete that the men inside the iron hull cannot tell where the sea ends and the abyss begins. They are running silent, running deep, running at 2.5 knots, barely faster than a man walks, through one of the most dangerous passages on the surface of the earth. Outside the curved steel walls, the Atlantic Ocean is attempting to swallow the Mediterranean Sea. Every second, millions of tons of water rush eastward through a gap barely 14 kilometers wide. The Strait of Gibraltar, a geological throat connecting to worlds. The current at the surface surges inward at 4 knots, and somewhere beneath it, a cold countercurrent flows west, back toward the open Atlantic. Finding it, riding it. That is the only way through. The commanding officer stands pressed against the attack periscope housing. He does not use the periscope. He does not dare. Above him, British destroyers circle the Narrows like wolves. Their Aztec sonar pings ripple through the water in invisible waves, searching, probing, hunting. Every sound inside this boat, a cough, a dropped wrench, a man drawing a breath too sharply, could mean instant death. He's threading a needle, in the dark, in a river, while men try to kill him. And here is the impossible thing. He's not trying to escape through the Strait of Gibraltar. He's trying to get in. Impossible outcome reveal between September 1941 and the final collapse of the Third Reich in 1945. 62 German U-boats made the attempt. 62 iron wolves slipped through that narrow throat in the dark, some taking 8 hours, some taking to full days. Crawling along the bottom, engines shut down, men barely breathing, riding a cold underwater river into the Mediterranean Sea. They entered carrying torpedoes, bringing death, hunting the Royal Navy's most prized warships. Within weeks of arriving, they would sink ships the British believed unsinkable. They would terrorize Allied supply lines. They would bring the war to waters the enemy considered secure. And then, every one of them would be trapped. Not one U-boat would ever escape back through the Strait of Gibraltar under its own power. Not one of the 62 that went in. Some were sunk in combat. Some were bombed in port. Some were captured. And the rest, surrounded on all sides by enemies and closing fronts, would be deliberately sent to the bottom of the sea by their own crews, their red and black ensigns hauled down for the last time in harbours that were already burning. The Mediterranean would become the largest U-boat graveyard in the world. This is the story of how that happened. Central question: how does the most feared naval weapon in human history become irreversibly trapped in an inland sea? How do 62 submarines, each crewed by trained, hardened men who had survived the North Atlantic, sail knowingly into a body of water from which there was virtually no exit? And when the walls closed in, when the ports fell, when the Allied nets stretched from Morocco to Spain and back again, when the destroyers multiplied and the aircraft never stopped circling, what happened in those final months? What happened to the men who understood, with cold certainty, that they were not coming home? Historical context: the Mediterranean, 1941, a sea the British owned in the summer of 1941. The Mediterranean was, in the language of British admirals, Mare Nostrum, our sea. It had been theirs for decades. The Royal Navy moved through it with the confidence of men walking through their own house. They controlled its western door at Gibraltar. They held its eastern approaches from Alexandria. Their warships refueled at Malta, that ancient, battered fortress island at the Mediterranean's geographic heart. And through this sea flowed the lifeblood of the British Empire: oil, troops, ammunition, food, the vast supply chain connecting London to Cairo, to India, to the Far East. On the southern shore, the Desert War was burning. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and his Afrika Corps had arrived in North Africa in February 1941 and immediately turned the entire campaign on its head. The British, who had been advancing steadily against the Italians, suddenly found themselves outfought, outmaneuvered, and in full retreat. Rommel needed supplies, tanks, fuel, ammunition. All of it had to cross the Mediterranean from Italian ports to North African harbours, and the Royal Navy, operating from Malta with submarines and surface ships, was destroying those convoys at a catastrophic rate. In the spring and summer of 1941, Rommel's supply situation was desperate. Entire convoys were being sunk. The British submarine HMS Upholder, captained by Commander Malcolm Wanklyn, alone sent more than 90,000 tons of Axis shipping to the bottom in a single year. Rommel was screaming to Berlin, without supplies, the Afrika Korps would wither and die in the desert regardless of the genius of its commander. Hitler had a solution. He had U-boats. In the North Atlantic, Germany's submarine fleet had spent 2 years tearing open the arteries of the British Empire. The Great Wolf Packs had sent millions of tons of Allied shipping to the bottom. Merchant seamen died by the thousands. Britain teetered on the edge of strangulation. The U-boats had done this operating from French Atlantic ports, Lorient, Brest, Saint-Nazaire, with the entire open ocean as their hunting ground. Why not bring them to the Mediterranean? Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, commander of the Kriegsmarine, had reservations. He understood what the U-boat commanders would eventually learn through bitter experience. The Mediterranean was not the North Atlantic. It was not the vast, dark, forgiving depths of an open ocean where a submarine could hide 4 days, weeks, without contact. The Mediterranean was a bathtub, a warm, clear, shallow bathtub. Its water was saltier, which meant different buoyancy, different trim calculations, a different feel under a captain's hands. Its weather patterns were violent and capricious. Its passages were narrow and controlled, and its single point of entry from the Atlantic was guarded by the most powerful naval base in the British Empire. But Hitler insisted. In the autumn of 1941, the order came down. U-boats would enter the Mediterranean, and so they came. Discovery of opportunity, the secret of the Countercurrent, the Strait of Gibraltar, had been studied by mariners for 2,000 years. The ancient Phoenicians knew it. The Romans mapped it. The Moors who built the great fortress on its northern shore had watched its waters for centuries. And every one of them had noticed the same phenomenon. The surface of the strait flows east, always east. An unbroken river of Atlantic water, pouring into the Mediterranean to replace what the hot southern sun evaporated from its surface. A current strong enough to be felt, to be fought against, to slow a sailing ship trying to move westward to a crawl, for a submarine trying to exit the Mediterranean unseen, running submerged, conserving battery power, unable to run diesel engines underwater. This surface current was a sentence of death. You could not fight it with a submerged boat. You would drain your batteries trying an either surface, where the British destroyers waited, or sink helpless to the bottom. But there was a second current, invisible, cold, moving in the opposite direction, at depth roughly 150 meters below the surface. A countercurrent flowed outward, westward, colder, denser salt water from the Mediterranean, sinking beneath the incoming Atlantic flow and escaping back into the open ocean. The physical geometry of the seas with different densities, locked in perpetual exchange. German naval intelligence knew of it. The U-boat command studied it carefully. If a boat could find that cold layer, if a captain could hold his nerve and trim his boat and creep along the bottom of the strait while British warships circled overhead, he could ride that countercurrent into the Mediterranean without using his engines at all. He could drift in like a ghost. The entry was theoretically possible. The exit, they would learn, was a different matter entirely. The countercurrent moving outward was real, but by 1943, the British had lined the strait with an almost impenetrable barrier. Detection loops on the seafloor, ASTIC-equipped destroyers operating in overlapping arcs, radar-equipped patrol aircraft flying day and night, searchlights mounted on the Rock of Gibraltar itself, sweeping the surface with the methodical patience of a lighthouse that had been repurposed for killing. The strait became, in the words of one German naval officer, a one-way valve, easy to enter, impossible to leave. The U-boats did not know this yet. The impossible plan operation. Enter the trap in the offices of the submarine command at Lorient. The orders were drawn up with the careful precision that characterized everything Admiral Karl Dönitz touched. Dönitz was the architect of the Wolfpack, a submariner from the First World War. He understood the underwater boat not merely as a weapon, but as a philosophy, a way of making weakness into strength, of turning the fact that you could not be seen into the most powerful weapon in the sea. He had built the Atlantic campaign from almost nothing, and he had watched his boats nearly win it. Now he was being asked to divert them into a side theatre. He complied, though not without protest. He would send the boats. They would follow specific protocols. Each U-boat would approach the strait from the Atlantic, timing its arrival for the darkest nights, new moon periods when even starlight could betray a periscope wake. It would submerge and descend to a depth that might find the westward countercurrent, then reverse its heading, pointing east toward the Mediterranean, and use that flowing water to be carried through passively, silently. Diesel engines would be shut down, electric motors running at minimum power. No unnecessary movement, no talking above a whisper. Men holding their breath while ASDIC pings rang through the hull, a bell being struck against iron. The passage would take between 6 and 9 hours if everything went perfectly. Longer if the countercurrent layer shifted or thinned. In that time, a single creak, a single mechanical malfunction, a slight miscalculation in depth, and a British destroyer would be overhead within minutes, dropping depth charges. And here was the most brutal part of the plan, the part that the men who received their orders understood immediately, even if they never said it aloud. There was no guarantee of return. There was no route mapped for coming back. The standing order spoke of the possibility of exit through Gibraltar once the situation in the Mediterranean permitted, which was naval language for, "We will think about that later." Later never came. Execution with high tension, the first wave. Autumn 1941, the first boats went in during the dark of September 1941. U-371 was among the pioneers, commanded by Valdemar Mell. Then came others in rapid succession through September and October: U-331, U-75, U-97, U-559. They submerged off the Portuguese coast, turned their bows toward the strait, and descended into the dark. The men who made those first runs described it afterward in letters, in debriefs, in the journals some of them kept against regulations, in the memories that would stay with them for the rest of their lives, however long or short those lives turned out to be. The cold was the first thing, even in the Mediterranean's relatively warm waters. At depth the temperature dropped sharply. Men wore woolen sweaters beneath their leather gear. Their breath fogged in the unheated compartments. The hull groaned occasionally with pressure changes, not catastrophically, but enough to remind every man aboard exactly where they were and exactly how thin the steel was between them and the weight of the ocean. The pinging was the worst. ASDIC sonar sent its searching pulses through the water every few seconds. Each ping arrived in the hull as a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, not loud, but penetrating, intimate, as though the sea itself was tapping its fingers on the steel and asking, "Are you in there?" The captain would watch his gauges, watch his depth, watch the needle of the compass as it swung toward east. He would check his watch, calculate the current speed against the nautical miles remaining, do the arithmetic again and again. Behind him, in the forward torpedo room, crammed between the massive tubes and the spare torpedoes lashed to the deck, men lay in their bunks fully dressed, unable to sleep, staring at the curved ceiling and counting each ping. One commander, writing after the war, described the experience with almost clinical precision. The strait demanded from us something that combat could not demand. In combat, there is action, there is something to do. In the strait, there was only stillness, only the waiting, only the sound of a machine somewhere above you, searching for your heartbeat. They made it through. One by one, over those autumn weeks, the U-boats emerged from the eastern end of the strait into the Mediterranean. Captains ordered the diesels started. Fresh air was pumped into compartments that smelled of diesel, sweat, anxiety, and bilge water. Men who had been silent for 8 hours suddenly found they had a great deal to say to one another. They had arrived. They were in. What they did next would rewrite the history of the naval war. On the morning of November 13, 1941, U-81 was running submerged near the western approaches to Gibraltar, technically still completing its transit into the Mediterranean operational area. Captain Lieutenant Friedrich Guggenberger was 26 years old. Through his periscope, he saw something that made every man on his crew fall silent when he reported it. HMS Ark Royal, the aircraft carrier that the German propaganda ministry had already publicly sunk, twice, in wildly exaggerated communiques. The ship the British press called the Unsinkable, one of the most famous warships in the Royal Navy. She was returning to Gibraltar, accompanied by a destroyer screen, moving at moderate speed, no particular evasive action, in waters that should have been safe. Guggenberger fired a spread of torpedoes, one hit. It was, by any technical measure, a small hit, a single torpedo. The carrier listed, but did not sink immediately. The Royal Navy immediately began towing operations. Tugs raced out from Gibraltar. 4 hours, it seemed like the Ark Royal might be saved. She sank the following morning, 14 miles from safety. 12 days later, on November 25, 1941, U-331E, commanded by 23-year-old Captain Lieutenant Hans Diedrich von Tiesenhausen, was operating off the North African coast near Sollum when it intercepted a Royal Navy battle squadron. Von Tiesenhausen penetrated the destroyer screen undetected. He found himself, improbably, inside the ring of escorts, closer to the main formation than any U-boat had a right to be. He was looking at HMS Barham, a Royal Sovereign-class battleship. 31,000 tons, 8 15-inch guns, a crew of over 1,000 men. He fired for torpedoes from close range. 3 struck. The Barham began to list immediately. Within 4 minutes, her magazines detonated. The ship disintegrated in a fireball visible from the North African coast. Of her crew of 1,259 men, 861 perished. The explosion was captured on film by a Royal Navy cameraman aboard an adjacent ship, footage so catastrophic that the British government suppressed it 4 months, fearing the effect on public morale. The film still exists. In less than a month, the Mediterranean U-boats had shattered 2 of Britain's most celebrated warships. The following summer, on August 11, 1942, U-73, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Helmut Rosenbaum, sank HMS Eagle, a carrier participating in Operation Pedestal, the desperate Allied convoy to Malta. 4 torpedoes, 8 minutes from impact to the moment the ship went below the surface. Over 160 men dead, 3 carriers. 3 ships the Royal Navy had counted on, gone. The U-boats of the Mediterranean were proving everything their commanders had promised, but the walls were already beginning to close. Climax moment, the turning tide, minus 1,943. Everything changed in a period of roughly 8 months. In November 1942, Operation Torch began. The Allied landings in North Africa. American troops landed in Morocco and Algeria. British forces simultaneously pressed from the east. Rommel's Africa Corps was caught in a vice, slowly compressed until its final surrender in Tunisia in May 1943. The North African coast, which had housed U-boat resupply facilities, provided navigational reference points, sheltered damaged boats in emergency anchorages, was gone. In July 1943, Operation Husky landed Allied forces in Sicily. In September 1943, Allied troops crossed to the Italian mainland, and then, on September 8, 1943, Italy surrendered. The announcement was made over the radio at 7:45 in the evening. In the Italian ports where German U-boats were based, La Spezia, Pola, Taranto, Naples, the news arrived like a physical blow. Men who had considered these harbours their homes, who had spent months building routines around Italian suppliers and mechanics and harbour pilots and local women who brought fresh vegetables to the dockside, suddenly found themselves in enemy territory. Italian forces, uncertain which way to point their weapons, mostly stood aside as German units moved to take control of the ports by force. There was violence, there was chaos. There was the particular horror of an alliance dissolving in real time, of men who had fought side by side for 2 years, suddenly pointing rifles at each other. The 29th U-boat flotilla, the command structure that coordinated Mediterranean operations from its headquarters first in Salamis, then La Spezia, then Toulon, now had to abandon most of its Italian basing. The boats concentrated in Toulon, in occupied southern France, which had been seized by German forces when the Vichy government collapsed. And the nature of the problem became, in the autumn of 1943, absolutely clear to every officer and every man in the Mediterranean Submarine Command. They were trapped. The Strait of Gibraltar, their only connection to the Atlantic, was now a killing ground of extraordinary density. The British had learned, through 2 years of bitter experience, exactly how U-boats moved through the Narrows. They had laid detection loops on the floor of the strait. They had positioned destroyers and corvettes in overlapping patterns that left no gap. They had extended their patrol aircraft coverage until there was no period of darkness sufficient for a boat to surface and charge batteries without being spotted. They had, in short, solved the problem. Several boats attempted exit runs. The records are incomplete, but the pattern is clear. They did not get through. Some were detected and forced to abort. Some were sunk in the attempt. The strait had become, definitively, impassable. One German admiral, surveying the situation from the operational files, is reported to have stated with unusual bluntness, "The boats in the Mediterranean are written off. We must accept this and use them as long as they remain operational." He was telling the truth. The men aboard those boats received no such memo. They continued to operate, continued to hunt, continued to patrol. They were professionals. Their world had always been dangerous. Death had always been likely. Many of them had already lost friends and crewmates to Allied attacks. The idea that their operational theatre had become a permanent assignment, that there was no going home, no rotation back to French Atlantic ports, no next assignment in Norway or the Baltic. This was an understanding that settled into the consciousness slowly, not like a thunderclap, but like a frost, gradual, penetrating. In the officers' mess at Toulon, men played cards and drank whatever wine they could obtain, and did not, by all accounts, discuss the exit question directly. They were going to keep fighting. That was the only sentence that made any kind of sense. Escape and consequences. The final months minus 1,944 and the scuttling at Toulon. By the spring of 1944, the Mediterranean U-boat force was a fraction of what it had been. Of the 62 boats that had entered, many had already been sunk in combat or destroyed by Allied air attack in port. Those that remained were increasingly unable to operate effectively. Allied air superiority had become overwhelming. The Bay of Biscay, which would have to be crossed for any Atlantic operation, was a graveyard for surface submarines. Even within the Mediterranean itself, air patrol density had reached a point where a boat could barely surface at night to charge batteries without triggering an attack. The patrol records from these months read like a slow strangulation. A boat departs Toulon, proceeds to its assigned patrol area, sights Allied shipping but cannot close to attack position because of aircraft coverage, returns to port. The next patrol, forced to abort and dive by a British patrol aircraft 4 hours after departure. The next, attacked with depth charges in the approaches to its own harbour, a crewman slightly wounded, periscope housing damaged, and again and again. The men were still going out, they were still fighting. But the mathematics were becoming impossible to ignore. In June 1944, the Allied landings in Normandy began reshaping the entire strategic picture. By August, Allied forces were racing through France. The liberation of Paris came their 25th of August. And almost simultaneously, in the south, Operation Dragoon, the Allied invasion of the French Mediterranean coast, put troops ashore in Provence, moving rapidly toward Toulon and Marseille. The end came quickly. On August 18, 1944, the order went out from the German High Command. The port of Toulon was to be denied to the enemy. What could not be withdrawn was to be destroyed. For the remaining U-boats, there was no withdrawal. They could not sail out through a strait, they could not penetrate. They could not be transported overland. There was, in the most literal possible sense, nowhere to go. The commanders gathered their crews. The orders were given, and the boats were scuttled. U-2 230, U-4 71, U-9 52, U-9 69, U-9 67, one by one, in the final days and hours before Allied forces entered Toulon. The remaining operational submarines of the Mediterranean force were deliberately sunk by their own crews. The process followed a grim procedure. Seacocks were opened. Explosive charges were set in the engine rooms. Confidential books and cipher materials were burned or thrown overboard with weighted bags. Personal possessions were packed into whatever could be carried. Men who had spent years aboard these vessels, who had learned every valve and gauge and mechanical personality of their boats, who had come to trust the steel and distrust the sea in equal measure, stood on the deck for the last time as the water rose around them. Several boat commanders are reported to have been the last man on deck, standing at the stern, watching the bow go under, then stepping off into the harbour water and swimming for the dock. The 29th U-boat flotilla officially ceased to exist on September 19, 1944. In the aftermath, the surviving crew members were reorganized into infantry units and sent to fight on the rapidly collapsing Western Front. Submariners who had never fired a rifle in anger, now being asked to stand in trenches against armies that had just crossed France. The particular cruelty of this redeployment was not lost on men who had spent years developing one of the most specialized and technically demanding skills in the entire German military. A few made it through the war, many did not. But what of the boats that had not yet been lost when they were scuttled? What of the commanders and crews who, with the war still technically ongoing, chose to destroy their own weapons rather than surrender them? There were at least 3 documented attempts in the summer and autumn of 1944 by individual U-boat commanders to force the Gibraltar passage one final time. The records are fragmentary. German naval archives for the Mediterranean theatre are incomplete, destroyed in the chaos of the final collapse, or still classified in various national repositories. But the pattern that emerges from survivor accounts, British intercepts, and post-war debriefs is consistent. Boats that attempted the westward passage through Gibraltar did not return, whether they were sunk by Allied forces in the strait, which seems most probable, or whether any succeeded and were subsequently lost in the Atlantic, or whether some made contact with neutral Spanish authorities and chose internment over death. These questions have never been entirely settled. There may be boats on the floor of the Strait of Gibraltar. There may be boats deeper in the Atlantic approaches, off Cape Trafalgar or the Portuguese coast, whose wrecks have never been definitively identified. The sea keeps its own records. Historical impact, what the Mediterranean U-boats changed, and what they failed to change. Assess the Mediterranean U-boat campaign honestly, and you find something that resists simple judgment. By the cold metrics of tonnage sunk and strategic objectives achieved, The campaign was a qualified success, followed by a total failure. In the opening phase, that extraordinary autumn and winter of 1941 and 1942, the U-boats delivered devastating blows. The sinkings of HMS Ark Royal, HMS Barham, and HMS Eagle shook the Royal Navy to its institutional core. These were not merchant ships. These were major fleet units. Their loss required immediate strategic reallocation of other vessels, complicated convoy operations, and forced the Admiralty to acknowledge that no body of water was genuinely safe. The disruption to Allied Mediterranean supply lines in 1942 was real and consequential. Malta came terrifyingly close to being starved into surrender. Operation Pedestal, the relief convoy that barely succeeded in August 1942, was opposed by every Axis asset in the Mediterranean: U-boats, Italian submarines, surface vessels, and land-based aircraft. That Malta survived was not inevitable. It was purchased at enormous cost. But against these achievements must be set the fundamental strategic miscalculation that sent the boats there. Every U-boat committed to the Mediterranean was a U-boat removed from the North Atlantic campaign, the campaign that had come closest to winning the war for Germany. In the winter of 1942-43, Dinitz's Wolfpacks reached their highest effectiveness against Allied merchant shipping. Britain was importing roughly a third of the food and fuel it needed. Another few months at those sinking rates, and the question of whether Britain could continue the war becomes genuinely open. Instead, the Mediterranean boats were fighting in a theatre that could not, even in the best possible outcome, be decisive. Rommel was going to lose the Desert War regardless. The supply lines could be disrupted, but not permanently cut. And once Italy fell, those 62 boats and the thousands of men who served aboard them became, from a German strategic standpoint, wasted. The broader lesson, one that military historians have returned to repeatedly, is that geography is not merely a context for strategy. Geography is strategy. The Strait of Gibraltar was not simply a difficult passage to navigate. It was a physical reality that transformed the Mediterranean into a one-way commitment. Anyone who ordered those boats in without a credible plan for getting them out had committed those men to what amounts, in hindsight, to a one-way mission dressed up in operational language. Whether the men who gave those orders understood this and chose not to say so, or whether they genuinely believed the exit problem would be solved later, this question has no clean answer. The documents suggest the latter. The outcome argues for the former. For the Allies, the Gibraltar anti-submarine barrier stands as one of the quiet triumphs of the naval war. The Royal Navy, working with American intelligence and technology, built a detection system sophisticated enough to trap a weapon specifically designed to be undetectable. The lessons learned in the Strait would directly inform the broader Battle of the Atlantic strategy that finally broke the Wolfpacks in the spring of 1943. The Mediterranean, in this sense, was a laboratory, a place where both sides learned, under lethal conditions, what worked and what did not. The wrecks and the questions that remain. The harbour of Toulon is a busy place today. Ferries cross it to the Îles Gers, sailboats tack through its approaches. The French Navy maintains its principal Mediterranean base there. On the waterfront, tourists drink pastis and watch the afternoon light change on the hillsides. Below the harbour bottom, scattered and partly obscured by silt and marine growth accumulated over 8 decades, lie the remains of the 29th U-boat flotilla. Divers have found them over the years. The curved hulls, their shapes unmistakable even in ruin, hatches and conning towers. Control room equipment, gauges still mounted in their brackets, needles frozen at whatever reading they held when the water came in. Personal effects occasionally, a boot, a tin cup, items that somehow survived the explosion and the decades and the silence. The remains of the boats are, under maritime law and the protocols governing military graves, protected from salvage, they rest where their crews put them. This is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Mediterranean U-boat story. The end was not something that happened to these men. It was something they chose. Trapped, facing certain capture or death, they made the decision to deny their weapons to the enemy and walk away from the vessels that had been their homes and their means of survival. They chose the cold water of the harbour over the indignity of surrender. Whether that choice was heroic was simply the logical terminus of a system that had already decided their fate without asking them. This is a judgment that history cannot make cleanly. There remains, even now, at least one question without a final answer. In the British Naval Archives, among the records of the Gibraltar Patrol Forces for the late summer and autumn of 1944, there are several reports of submerged contacts in the western approaches to the strait. Contacts tracked, depth charged, and reported as probable kills, for which no confirmed German hull has ever been positively identified. The wrecks in question, if they exist, lie in deep water west of Gibraltar, on the Atlantic side. Were these the final attempts? The last boats whose commanders chose to try the impossible transit one more time, pointed west, toward home, toward the Atlantic, toward the illusion of a return that the geography had made impossible for 3 years. Did they get close? Did they find the countercurrent in the dark? Did they hear the pings above them and hold their course for one more nautical mile? And then one more. The sea does not answer these questions. The archives offer only the language of patrol reports. Contact gained at 14-12 hours. Depth charges dropped. Probable destruction of U-boat type. No wreckage recovered. Probable. No wreckage recovered. Somewhere on the floor of the Atlantic, west of the Rock of Gibraltar, there may be a steel hull, a boat that almost made it. Instruments still mounted, gauges frozen, the particular silence of machines that have been stopped for a very long time. A boat that went in through a one-way door and spent 3 years looking for a way out and finally, in the last season of the war, pointed its bow west and tried one more time. We do not know if it was brave. We do not know if it was desperate. We do not know if, in those final hours in the narrow water, the crew understood that they were not going to make it, or if they believed, with the particular stubbornness of men who have survived everything the sea has thrown at them, that this time would be different. What we know is this: 62 boats went in. The sea kept all of them.